In this episode, we're looking at horrifying bear attacks. From a runner on a familiar city trail who ran straight into a waiting bear, to a playground where children scattered as bears emerged without warning. But first, we begin in a quiet backyard, where a woman was mauled just steps from her own door. It was June 18th, 2014, in a semi-rural subdivision on the outskirts of Missoula, Montana, where backyards bordered a narrow drainage corridor used by wildlife. The morning was clear and quiet, with sprinklers running and birds moving through the trees. Margaret Hale, 72, was a retired elementary school librarian who had lived in the house for more than 30 years. Margaret was known among neighbors as structured and methodical. After her husband's death, she remained in the home, maintaining a routine she rarely altered. Gardening organized her days. She kept handwritten notes on planting dates, pruning schedules and yields, and regularly shared excess produce with nearby families. That spring, authorities issued a general advisory for neighborhoods along the edge of Missoula, following an increase in black bear activity. The area behind Margaret Hale's street backed onto a shallow drainage corridor that connected undeveloped parcels, offering cover and a consistent travel route for wildlife. Bears had once been uncommon enough to be treated as unusual rather than expected there when many homes were built decades earlier. But in the 2 years leading up to 2014, dry conditions and nearby development pushed animals closer to residential areas. Several residents reported trash bins overturned overnight. One household found claw marks on an apple tree along the street. Another neighbor reported a bear crossing the road shortly after dusk. The sightings were scattered but consistent, clustered along the corridor behind the homes. Wildlife officials advised residents to remove attractants, including bird feeders and fallen fruit. Neighbors later told investigators that Margaret Hale had been warned. Bear advisories were posted, and nearby residents mentioned sightings during brief conversations over fences and at the mailbox. According to those neighbors, she acknowledged the warnings, but kept her routine unchanged. Shortly after 7 a.m. on June 18th, Margaret was in her yard picking raspberries along the fence line. The raspberry canes were dense and shoulder-high, limiting visibility and keeping her attention focused low. Behind the yard, the drainage corridor ran beneath the road through a concrete culvert, providing uninterrupted cover. A light wind carried scent away from the yard toward the corridor, while nearby sprinklers created a steady background noise. The bear entered the yard through the corridor. Based on tracks and later assessments, wildlife officials believed it was a subadult American black bear, likely a roaming male displaced by larger adults. Subadult males in western Montana commonly weigh between 150 and 250 pounds and are prone to investigating calorie-dense food sources. Fallen raspberries and residual birdseed were present near the fence line. The bear moved head low and deliberate, already feeding when it crossed into the yard. Its approach went unnoticed. Margaret remained unaware until the animal was very close. Her next-door neighbor, Elaine Porter, was watering plants near the shared fence and had a partial view. Elaine later reported seeing birds flush suddenly from the raspberry patch seconds before the encounter, lifting off at once. At the time, she did not recognize it as a warning sign. Margaret noticed movement when the bear was within roughly 15 feet. She straightened and raised her hands, shouting. The sudden motion startled the bear at extremely close range. With no space to retreat and already conditioned to feeding in the area, it lunged. Margaret was struck and knocked backward into the raspberry canes. She fell awkwardly, legs tangling in the stems, hitting the ground hard. The plastic bowl dropped and spilled berries into the soil. The bear followed, making brief contact. Its weight pinned her momentarily as she tried to curl inward. Witnesses later described sharp snapping sounds as canes broke, followed by forceful huffing. The bear delivered several slashing blows with its forepaws and a single bite to Margaret's forearm as she raised her arms defensively. The contact was violent, but brief. There was no pursuit across the yard. The attack remained localized to where she fell. Elaine shouted and struck the chain-link fence repeatedly with a shovel. Another neighbor activated a car alarm. A truck horn sounded from the street. As the noise escalated and people moved closer, the bear disengaged. It stepped back, paused, then retreated toward the drainage corridor, exiting the yard the same way it entered. From first contact to withdrawal, the encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Emergency services arrived within minutes. Margaret was conscious when responders reached her but severely injured. She had suffered significant blood loss, deep lacerations to the scalp and upper body, and a compound fracture to one forearm caused by the fall and bite. She was transported to a regional trauma center. Medical records later showed that Margaret was on anticoagulant medication for a cardiac condition, complicating clotting and surgical recovery. Despite emergency surgery and wound management, she developed a severe infection related to contaminated bite wounds. Over the following days, her condition deteriorated. She died 3 days later from sepsis and multi-organ failure secondary to traumatic injuries. Following the incident, authorities set traps along the drainage corridor and conducted patrols in the surrounding area. A black bear matching the size and behavior profile was captured and euthanized within a week, based on proximity and behavior, though officials could not confirm it was the same animal involved in the attack. Additional attractant removal was enforced across the neighborhood, and residents were instructed to keep yards clear through the remainder of the season. Margaret's house was sold the following year. Her garden remained unattended through the summer. By fall, weeds overtook the raspberry patch, the canes bending under their own weight, unharvested. Margaret Hale was attacked behind her home, a yard she'd trusted for decades. Bears don't separate yards from trails. When food and cover meet routine movement, risk shifts location. In Anchorage, that risk followed a runner onto a river trail. It was August 9th, 2016, just before sunrise along a public river trail near downtown Anchorage. The temperature sat in the low 50s, the air cool and still. Streetlights cast weak yellow pools across mostly empty parking areas, while distant traffic arrived in soft, uneven bursts. Beside the trail, Ship Creek ran high with summer meltwater, fast and noisy, its surface broken by salmon pushing upstream toward spawning grounds. Jason Calder, 34, was walking the trail after finishing a night shift at a warehouse distribution center. He worked rotating overnight hours as an inventory clerk, a schedule that left his days fragmented. To keep some sense of order, Jason followed a strict routine. He slept through the late morning, worked overnight, and exercised in the early morning before heading home. Walking and running helped him stay alert and regulate sleep. He tracked his mileage and favored the Ship Creek Trail for its flat surface, predictable footing, and proximity to his apartment. Jason was not impulsive or reckless. Friends described him as methodical. He avoided alcohol during the work week, kept to familiar routes, and stayed on established trails. That morning, he wore reflective running shoes and an armband holding his phone. He used a single open-ear earbud, leaving the other ear unobstructed so he could hear cyclists, vehicles, or movement nearby. Growing up in Alaska, Jason was familiar with wildlife. He understood that brown bears followed salmon runs and that waterways, especially creeks cutting through urban areas, could function as travel corridors. During previous summers, he had seen bears from a distance along rivers outside the city, usually at dusk or dawn. That summer, Anchorage experienced an unusually strong salmon return. The abundance pushed brown bears farther along creek systems, including stretches of Ship Creek that paralleled public trails and industrial areas. Anglers had posted online about bears feeding near the water early in the morning, often retreating into brush when people approached. Most sightings ended without incident. The section of trail Jason used remained open, with no posted closures or official warnings. He did not carry bear spray, believing the downtown adjacent setting and regular foot traffic reduced the risk enough to make it unlikely he would need it. The trail narrowed as it curved tightly along the creek, passing through a constricted section bordered by alder and willow. In several places, dense vegetation rose directly off the gravel, limiting visibility to less than 15 feet. The creek ran loud there, water striking rocks and submerged branches in a continuous rush. The smell of wet soil and fish hung in the air. As the trail dipped slightly to follow the bend, anyone moving through the area would have little warning of what lay ahead. Downstream, 2 anglers were already positioned near a shallow bend in the creek. They had arrived before dawn and switched off their headlamps as daylight grew. Both men later reported noticing aggressive splashing upstream, short, forceful disturbances followed by sudden stillness. During peak season, that pattern often meant predator feeding. They noted it but stayed in place, expecting the activity to remain confined to the water. Brown bears in south-central Alaska commonly exceed 600 pounds, with large adult males approaching or surpassing 900. During salmon season, they feed intensively, often with heads down and attention fixed on the water. In narrow creek corridors with dense vegetation and heavy ambient noise, bears may tolerate human presence until a person appears suddenly at close range. When startled at very short distances, especially while feeding, defensive reactions can occur without warning displays or bluff charges. Jason rounded the blind curve at a steady pace. Less than 10 feet from the trail, a large brown bear was feeding in shallow water, partially concealed by brush. Investigators later documented disturbed gravel, crushed vegetation, and fish remains consistent with active feeding at that exact location. The wind that morning blew from the creek toward the trail, carrying Jason's scent away from the bear. Combined with the noise of rushing water, thick brush, and the curve of the path, neither detected the other until the final moment. When the bear burst from the brush, the movement was sudden and direct, a short surge rather than a prolonged charge. The time between emergence and contact was less than a second. Jason began to turn away, but his right foot slipped on loose gravel near the trail's edge. The bear struck from behind, driving Jason face down into wet gravel at the water's edge. His upper body slid partly into the shallow flow. The impact forced the air from his lungs. One angler later described hearing a single heavy thud followed by a brief, cut-off shout. Almost immediately, the sound of rushing water and snapping brush drowned everything else. The bear pinned Jason using body weight rather than repeated strikes. Its forelimbs pressed him into the ground, restricting movement. Bite contact followed quickly, concentrated at the upper back and neck. Investigators later described the pattern as consistent with a close-range defensive response during feeding, rather than predatory behavior. Jason's legs kicked against the gravel as he tried to push forward, his shoes scraping and carving shallow trenches where his feet searched for traction. Claw marks raked across his calves and thighs as the bear adjusted its stance. Blood appeared in the shallow water within seconds, spreading in thin, uneven streams downstream. The bear maintained pressure briefly, then shifted its weight, churning water and gravel together. One of the anglers discharged bear spray from several yards away. The wind was blowing upriver, away from the attack, causing much of the spray to disperse before reaching the animal. The bear lifted its head, shook briefly, then delivered another bite before stepping back. The second angler shouted and threw rocks toward the bear's hindquarters. Both men later said they feared provoking a renewed charge. From first contact to disengagement, the encounter lasted less than a minute. The bear moved upriver along the bank, pausing to shake its head and paw at its muzzle, before disappearing into dense vegetation. Jason did not move. After waiting several seconds to confirm the bear had withdrawn, the anglers approached. Jason was unresponsive, with catastrophic injuries visible to his upper body and neck. There was no detectable breathing or pulse. One angler called 911 while the other attempted to assess for signs of life without moving him. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene based on the extent of trauma and absence of vital signs. Law enforcement secured the area, documenting tracks, blood patterns, and the bear's path of retreat. The trail was closed immediately, and officers cleared the corridor of other trail users. Investigators recovered Jason's phone from an armband still secured to his arm. The fitness app showed his route ending abruptly at the curve. His open-ear headphones were found nearby, one earpiece torn free. There was no evidence he had seen the bear before contact. Wildlife officials initiated patrols along Ship Creek. 2 days later, a large brown bear displaying unusually bold behavior approached anglers in another section of the corridor. Based on size, location, and timing, the animal was considered a likely match. After euthanization, DNA recovered from the bear's mouth and claws matched the biological material collected from Jason's clothing. Necropsy findings confirmed recent salmon feeding and human contact. The trail reopened after 36 hours with additional warning signage installed near blind curves and brush-heavy sections. Jason Calder's death was attributed to a sudden close-range encounter during peak salmon activity, an event shaped by routine, environment, and timing, where recognition came too late to alter the outcome. Jason Calder stayed on the trail, avoided brush, and never approached wildlife. The attack unfolded in under a minute at a blind curve. In Arizona, the pattern repeated, this time at a playground, where people and bears were separated by yards. It was May 27, 2018, at an edge-of-town park on Flagstaff's east side. The afternoon was warm and clear, settling into the quiet rhythm of a Sunday after lunch. Children moved between swings and slides, while adults sat in scattered shade. Denise Morado, 41, a part-time preschool aide, was at the park that afternoon, a familiar place she had visited many times over the years. Denise lived a few miles from the park and followed her routines closely, both at work and outside of it. She was known as dependable and methodical, more comfortable in familiar settings than unfamiliar ones. Having grown up in Flagstaff, she understood that wildlife was part of daily life: elk crossing roads in winter, coyotes appearing at dusk, and occasional black bear sightings discussed casually among neighbors, rather than treated as emergencies. American black bears in northern Arizona are highly adaptable omnivores and routinely move closer to town during dry periods, drawn by unsecured trash, fruit trees, bird feeders, and reduced natural forage. That spring, Denise had heard other parents mention animals appearing closer to residential areas. The comments were brief and unspecific. Someone mentioned a bear near a dumpster. Another said trash had been tipped over overnight. There were no emergency alerts issued, no park closures, and no notices posted at the playground entrance. Nothing that afternoon suggested elevated risk, or that the park required special caution beyond the general awareness residents were accustomed to. After lunch, Denise brought her 7-year-old niece and a neighbor's child to the shaded playground. It wasn't planned as a special outing, just a familiar stop to pass a few quiet hours before dinner. The park sat along Flagstaff's eastern edge, where residential streets met ponderosa pine forest. Northern Arizona was in its second consecutive year of drought conditions, and later wildlife reports confirmed a poor spring forage season that had contributed to an increase in urban bear activity. Denise settled at a picnic table roughly 25 to 30 yards from the play structure, close enough to watch the swings, slide, and climbing frame without hovering. Her phone lay face down beside her keys. A half-empty water bottle left a dark ring of condensation on the tabletop. She watched the children move between equipment, calling out reminders to take turns or slow down. Every few minutes, she stood to adjust her view or stepped closer when they drifted toward the edge of the playground. Counting heads was automatic, a habit shaped by years supervising classrooms and recess yards. The park felt ordinary. Families came and went. A couple walked a dog along the paved path. Wind moved through the pines, shifting patches of shade across the grass. The forest bordered the park on two sides, close enough to frame the space but not close enough to feel immediately threatening. Small yellow signs near trailheads generally warned of wildlife common to the region. There were no closures posted and no temporary warnings issued that day. Behind the playground, the forest edge was uneven. Tall pines cast long shadows and dry needles carpeted the ground beneath them. The grass thinned as it approached the trees, turning brittle where irrigation ended. Birds moved briefly between branches, then went quiet. Earlier that afternoon, a park groundskeeper had cleaned up trash knocked over near the parking lot, likely overnight, an incident that drew little attention at the time. Black bears are common in northern Arizona, particularly where the forest borders a town. Juveniles and subadult males, often weighing between 150 and 250 pounds, are frequently displaced by larger adults and roam widely in search of food. During drought years, bears increase daytime movement and venture into open spaces more readily. While black bears typically avoid people, sudden close-range encounters can trigger rapid defensive contact, especially when a bear is already moving toward a food source and its perceived escape route becomes obstructed. Shortly after 2:30 p.m., a dark shape emerged from the forest edge and crossed the open grass at a steady walk. Several adults noticed it at roughly the same time. From a distance of about 40 to 50 yards, backlit by afternoon sun, it was briefly mistaken for a large off-leash dog. Its head stayed low, shoulders rolling as it moved with an efficient ground-covering gait rather than a full run. Children continued playing. No one shouted. Recognition lagged behind motion. Several witnesses stated that Denise stood up as soon as she appeared to recognize the animal. One parent said she saw Denise step forward from the picnic table with her arms raised, calling out loudly for the children to come back. Multiple witnesses reported that the bear changed behavior at that moment, shifting from a steady walk into a brief rush. One witness estimated the distance closed in just a few seconds. Others said Denise's movement seemed to draw the bear's attention directly toward her, reducing the space between them before anyone had time to react. She turned partially sideways, but the bear struck her hip and knocked her backward into the mulch border surrounding the playground. The impact was sudden and forceful. Denise fell onto her side. The bear delivered a brief bite to her left thigh, then lunged upward and clamped onto her shoulder. The contact lasted only seconds. There was no prolonged mauling. The bear's weight pressed her into the ground, scattering mulch and dust, before it released and stepped back without attempting to pursue or reposition. Screams erupted across the playground. One parent pulled a child from the slide and ran toward the parking lot. Another backed away while pushing a stroller between herself and the bear. The groundskeeper near the restroom shouted and waved a rake. Several adults moved forward together, arms raised, shouting in unison. The coordinated response closed the distance without any single individual separating from the group, a factor later noted by wildlife officials. The bear hesitated, then retreated toward the trees, crossing the grass and disappearing back into the forest without further contact. From the first movement to withdrawal, the encounter lasted well under 1 minute. Denise remained on the ground, conscious and responsive. Blood soaked into the mulch beneath her leg and shoulder. Her breathing was rapid but controlled. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within approximately 6 to 8 minutes, consistent with urban response times. Multiple witnesses, including parents and the groundskeeper, gave consistent accounts describing the bear's approach, the brief contact, and the group response that prompted its retreat. Denise was alert when responders reached her. They controlled bleeding, immobilized her injuries, and transported her to the hospital. Doctors identified deep puncture wounds, muscle tearing, and nerve damage to her left thigh and shoulder, consistent with a brief bite-and-release defensive encounter. There were no crush injuries or extensive skeletal trauma. Surgery addressed wound contamination and tissue damage. Denise survived but lost significant strength and mobility in her leg and partial function in her shoulder. Recovery required multiple procedures and months of rehabilitation. She did not return to her preschool job due to permanent physical limitations. Wildlife officers monitored the area using public reports and trail cameras along known corridors. A subadult black bear matching witness descriptions was captured several weeks later and relocated outside city limits, a standard first response management action. Over the following months, it was involved in repeated nuisance incidents near residential areas. After continued human contact, the bear was euthanized under standard management protocols. The playground reopened after a short closure. New fencing appeared along the forest edge, and trash containers were replaced with locking lids. No public statement directly linked the changes to the attack. Families returned. Children played. Denise relocated out of state during her recovery. The forest remained close enough to reach the grass in seconds, unchanged. Thanks for watching. Click the next video to see how ordinary routines can turn fatal when people cross paths with predators built to survive where humans least expect them.